Chapter 9. Mighta, coulda. Dylan stood at the edge of the mountain overlook, his arms crossed as he gazed on the town of Colton far below him. Where he stood the ground was a bare rocky piece of land that was a sharp contrast to the thick woods beside it. Scraggly bunches of green weeds pushed their way up through the hard dirt, bowing their heads when the wind kicked up as it often did this time of day. The trail to the cliff started near the cabin he shared with his brother and ran through the forest to where he stood. Dylan raised his face to the breeze, enjoying the feel as it raced across his bare skin. The gust buffeted the back of his old t-shirt before calming down. To him, the wind was the only thing that seemed to have true freedom, rushing at will from the valleys to the hills, stirring grasses and clouds alike. But it comes up empty, he thought. Like me. Dylan looked down at Colton. It was something he now often did. He didn't know why not for sure, but the town drew him. He wished he belonged there, or somewhere, but he'd burnt a lot of bridges. For so long, he'd chased freedom. Now he wanted more. He scoffed at himself. More of what? More like today. What are people thinking? He wondered how many times he'd had the same thought. Dylan's friends believed he had an amazing ability to read others, but not Dylan. He often felt people were a mystery to him, which struck him as odd, being as he was one. One ought to know one's own kind. Dylan crouched, sitting on his heels, and picked up a stone, weighed it in his hand and threw it down the side of the mountain. It made a couple sharp ticks on the rock below as it fell, then nothing. The thought he'd been shoving down all day worked its way to his mind. I saw her today. Stop. Think about something else, anything else. Wade knows what he's talking about. She isn't for me. Yeah, think of Wade going off on his tangent. After being closed up in that store with all those people, Wade had been downright irritable. When his brother got riled up, one was never sure what kind of crazy would come out. Dylan chuckled. Wade got worked up most days. And if Wade was in trouble, it was often his words that got him there. They'd gone down the mountain for a few supplies and to see what all the hubbub was about. That's what old man Larson called it. Hubbub. The old guy had seen people raiding stores in Fenton on TV, and he wanted to know how bad it was here in Colton. It seemed things were falling apart as this disease spread. Larson was a curious man. To satisfy that curiosity, he'd walked, cane and all, the good mile or so to the Coles cabin and asked the brothers if they'd mind seeing what all the fuss was about. Dylan and Wade agreed to go and get him some groceries too. How a man like himself got roped into these situations baffled Dylan, but Larson had hobbled all the way over. And though the Coles weren't sure exactly how old the man was, they both agreed he looked at least 101. So, they had to go. The brothers scrounged up enough money for each of them to have a hamburger at McDonald's. They later slumped in a booth biting into hot, greasy burgers while entertained by a drunken Frankie Bailey trying to cross the busy street. They'd snorted and scoffed. Wade had even let out a few loud hoots. The comedy ended when a kid ran up and tried to help him. You think that's Frankie's boy? I heard he had a couple kids, Wade said as he chomped on his sandwich. Could be. Dylan's eyes stayed glued to the youngster, watching as the boy did his best to aid his father despite his old man's efforts to swat him off. Wonder if Frankie wails on him, the way Frankie's dad used to. Wade stopped as Frankie backhanded the young man in the face. Both men automatically grunted their disapproval, each remembering the harsh smack of a man's hand on their own young faces. Wade shook his head. I reckon so. Dylan's head jerked back as if he had been the one slapped. He looked at the ground, across the street, at the coffee shop, anywhere to ignore what was happening in front of him, to ignore the stone gathering weight in his stomach and the flame igniting in his chest. But without permission, Dylan's troubled gaze strayed back to Frankie and his son. The young man pulled at his father, trying to get him away from the rushing vehicles. Frankie teetered on the edge of the sidewalk, ready to fall into the oncoming traffic. A few horns blared, startling the drunk man. Frankie jerked his arm from the boy's grasp and pushed him hard enough the boy fell and came back up holding a bleeding head. Dylan bolted to his feet. Sit down, brother, Wade said, you can't do nothing about that, and you know it. Dylan threw out his arm toward the scene playing out in front of them. That's the problem. No one ever does anything about that. Wade compressed his lips and sucked the bottom one in. It is what it is. Ain't nothing we haven't been through. I'm gonna talk to him. Frankie? Dylan scraped his foot against the floor and gathered his hands into fists. Yeah. I know what you're fixing to do, and it ain't talking. Since when have you and Frankie ever talked about anything? A fight is more likely. That's gonna get you a few days in jail again, and nothin'll change. It ain't even worth the walk across the street. Dylan disagreed. The boy was worth the walk. Letting the boy see someone willing to stand up for him, that alone was worth it. Dylan took a step toward the door just as a police car pulled up alongside Frankie and his son. The officer waved the young man into the front of the vehicle, put Frankie in the back, then drove off. Dylan dropped into his seat and ripped another chunk off his hamburger. Wade glanced at him. See, all taken care of. And you didn't have to lift a finger. Dylan grunted. He wouldn't have minded a little jail time if he'd gotten to smash Frankie in the face. There had been an ongoing fight between Dylan and Frankie since their kindergarten days. Frankie was an idiot then. And he was an idiot now. Dylan couldn't abide idiots. It was then Wade's mouth got him into trouble. The TV blared the latest on the virus. The good citizens of Colton, children and all, hung breathlessly onto every word. Wade chose that time to blurt out, "This flu may do us all a favor. Clean this world out. It could lose a good portion of people and still do just fine." If Wade had a normal voice, it would have only reached Dylan, especially given the excessive volume of the TV, and the fact that no customers were sitting at the tables near them. But Wade often used what people called their outside voice when he was inside. His words boomed to every corner of the restaurant. Dylan could almost hear the whip of every head as it turned toward them. He groaned. If they didn't leave now, they'd ask them to go. Dylan picked up the final bit of his hamburger and walked to the door. He held it open for his brother. He said, "Wade, do you think just once I could finish my meal before you go riling up the townsfolk?" Wade looked around the dining area and took in the scowls facing him. He mumbled, "I ain't saying nothing but the truth." When Wade turned toward his audience to say more, Dylan shoved him out the door. The fact was, it was easy enough for the Coles to rile people up. The Cole family, in most of the town's opinion, had been one long line of trouble for generations now. Virgil, their father, had lived a dark life, and as far as most of the folks were concerned, Wade and Dylan weren't much better. Those that didn't look down on them usually feared them. Some people did both. After leaving McDonald's, the Cole brothers headed to Smith's, or Anderson's, if you trusted the sign. They didn't. As they walked out of the market, Dylan knew if he was being honest with himself, he had to admit that Wade just might be right. Frankie and a few others could go. Trouble was the disease wasn't letting them pick, and more often than not, the good people were the ones lost. The little jackass in the grocery store could go. Anyone who would take advantage of those around him, they can go. Dylan had no choice but to stop him. If the fool got away with that, then others would try it. People helped each other here, that's what they did. The way he'd helped Sky. Dylan shook his head at himself. It always comes back around to her anymore. Unsure why, Dylan nevertheless felt the weight within him lighten as it always did whenever his mind turned to her. She's a good woman, ready to plunk that kind of money down for her friend. The wind blew a little harder, lifting his dark hair off the back of his neck as he let his mind linger on her.